The neon sign of the Manila Metropolitan Hospital flickered with a rhythmic, dying buzz, casting a sickly violet hue over the puddles in the parking lot. I remember standing there, the humid air clinging to my skin like a wet shroud, realizing that the smell of hospital bleach had become my new perfume. My daughter, Amihan, was fighting a war inside a plastic incubator, her lungs too thin to hold the weight of the world. Every beep of the heart monitor was a hammer blow to my soul, a reminder that survival in this city had a price tag, one that was currently bleeding our bank accounts dry. My husband, Raphael, sat in the corner of the waiting room, his head in his hands. I thought he was praying. I wanted to believe he was pleading with the heavens for our daughter's life. But when his phone buzzed and he flinched, I saw a flash of something in his eyes that wasn't grief. It was guilt. Pure, unadulterated shame. I didn't say anything. I had learned that in the quiet moments of a crisis, silence is a more effective weapon than any accusation. I watched him walk to the window, his silhouette framed by the sprawling, chaotic lights of Quezon City. He looked older, the boyish charm that had once won my heart replaced by deep, jagged lines of exhaustion. Then she arrived. Tala, his younger sister, walked through the sliding doors as if she were stepping onto a red carpet at a Makati gala rather than a ward for struggling infants. She was draped in silk, the scent of expensive French perfume cutting through the sterile air like a knife. She didn't look at the incubator. She didn't ask about the oxygen levels. She looked at Raphael and gestured toward the hallway. I followed them, moving with the stealth of a woman who had already lost everything and therefore had nothing left to fear. I stood behind a heavy fire door, my heart hammering against my ribs. Tala's voice was a sharp whisper, dripping with a sense of entitlement that made my skin crawl. She wasn't there to offer help. She was demanding her allowance. She spoke of a trip to El Nido, a healing retreat she claimed she needed because the stress of our daughter's illness was affecting her. Aesthetic. Then, the conversation took a darker turn. She mentioned the Bacolod incident, a name that sent a chill down my spine. She reminded Raphael that if the truth about what happened 10 years ago surfaced, his precious little family would be living in the slums of Tondo within a week. Raphael didn't fight back. He just nodded, his shoulders slumped in defeat. That was the moment I realized I wasn't just fighting for my daughter's life. I was married to a man who was being hollowed out by a monster of his own blood. The following days were a blur of calculated observations. I didn't confront Raphael about the Bacolod incident. Instead, I became a ghost in my own home, watching the way he avoided my gaze and how his hands trembled whenever he checked the business ledgers. We ran a logistics firm, small, but enough to keep us comfortable until the medical bills started piling up like autumn leaves in a storm, but the numbers weren't adding up. Large sums were being transferred to an offshore account registered under a shell company called Jinto Horizon. It didn't take a detective to realize Jinto meant Goldtala's nickname. She was draining the lifeblood of our company while our daughter gasped for air. During one of my late-night vigils at the hospital, I encountered a man I hadn't noticed before. He was an orderly, a middle-aged Filipino man named Lido, with calloused hands and eyes that seemed to hold the secrets of 1,000 tragedies. He moved through the ICU with a quiet authority that felt out of place for someone in his position. One night, as I sat weeping silently by Amihan's side, he placed a small wooden rosary on the edge of the incubator. He didn't say a word, but he looked at me with a profound, knowing sorrow. Later that night, I found a folded piece of paper in the pocket of my coat. It wasn't a prayer. It was a list of dates and license plate numbers, all tracing back to a warehouse in the Port District, the same district where Mateo, Raphael's partner, spent most of his time. The intrigue deepened when I visited the warehouse under the guise of looking for misplaced paperwork. I found Mateo there, but he wasn't alone. He was with a man in a tailored barong, someone I recognized from the news Senator Enriquez. They weren't discussing logistics. They were looking at architectural blueprints for a luxury resort in Palawan. the very same El Nido project Tala had been bragging about. The betrayal was multi-layered. It wasn't just a sister-in-law's greed. It was a systematic dismantling of our lives to fund a political playground. I realized then that Lido, the orderly, was more than he seemed. He was watching them, and, for some reason, he had chosen me to be his witness. I felt like a pawn in a game I didn't understand. But as I looked at the blueprints, I saw my husband's signature at the bottom of a contract that sold our soul to the senator. The following days were a blur of calculated observations and whispered warnings. I started meeting Lido, the hospital orderly, in the cramped cafeteria, where the air was thick with the smell of cheap rice and fried galangong. He never spoke much, but his silence was heavy with meaning. He would push a folded newspaper toward me, his thumb lingering on articles about Senator Enriquez's clean air initiatives. One afternoon, he left a small, tarnished silver locket on the table. Inside was a photo of a young girl who looked hauntingly like Amihan, Lido's daughter. She hadn't died of a random illness. She had been a victim of the Bacolod incident, a catastrophic chemical leak at a textile factory 10 years ago, a factory that had been owned by the Enriquez family but managed on paper by Rafael's father. My father-in-law hadn't just been a failure. He had been the designated fall guy for a crime that had poisoned a whole village. The realization hit me like a tropical storm during the monsoon season. My husband's family debt wasn't a matter of honor. It was a blood price. Rafael had been sending money to Ginto Horizon under the impression that it was going to a victim's fund, a way to atone for his father's sins. But Lido showed me bank records, obtained through a network of former factory workers, proving that not a single centavo had ever reached the families in Bacolod. The money was being recycled. Tala wasn't just a spoiled socialite. She was the senator's primary money launderer, using her luxury lifestyle as a front to move funds back into Enriquez's re-election campaign. She was using her own brother's guilt and our daughter's medical crises to fuel a political machine. The Bacolod incident was the leash they used to keep Rafael obedient, a collar made of shame and the threat of prison. That night, Emihan's condition took a terrifying turn. The doctor spoke of a rare complication, a sudden drop in blood pressure that required a specialized medication, not covered by our dwindling insurance. I watched Rafael in the hallway, his face ghostly pale as he spoke into his phone, begging someone for a loan. I knew who was on the other end. I could see the reflection of his desperation in the glass of the nursery. He wasn't just losing his daughter, he was losing his mind to his sister, who saw our tragedy as a line item in a ledger. I stood behind him, my shadow merging with his, but I didn't reach out to comfort him. Instead, I felt a cold, sharp clarity. I realized that to save my child, I would have to destroy the family he had spent his life trying to protect. I would have to become the detective in a case where my own husband was the prime suspect's accomplice. I waited until the small hours of the morning, when the hospital was a cavern of echoes and flickering fluorescent lights. Rafael had finally collapsed into a fitful sleep in the plastic chair by the ward. I took his keys and drove to our office in the Port District, a place that usually smelled of salt and diesel, but tonight felt like a tomb. I bypassed the security cameras, a trick Lido had taught me during one of our brief encounters, and entered the back room where the old paper archives were kept. I wasn't looking for digital files. I was looking for the physical receipts of the Bacolod settlement. After hours of searching through boxes filled with dust and the ghosts of failed contracts, I found it. A black leather-bound ledger hidden inside a crate marked as damaged goods. The ledger wasn't just a record of payments. It was a diary of betrayal. Every page was a testament to how Mateo, the man my husband called his brother, had systematically manipulated the company's accounts to hide the senator's bribes. But the true horror lay in the handwritten notes in the margins. They weren't in Mateo's handwriting. They were in Tala's. She had been the architect of the entire scheme since she was 18, far more calculating than any of us had realized. She had even documented the incidental costs of keeping the Bacolod families silent bribes to local officials, threats to witnesses, and the exact amount paid to a doctor to falsify the autopsy report of Lito's daughter. My hands shook so violently the pages blurred. My sister-in-law wasn't just stealing our money. She was a participant in a decade-long cover-up of mass poisoning. Suddenly, the heavy metal door of the archive room creaked open. I didn't turn around, but the smell of expensive, cloying tobacco told me exactly who it was. Mateo stood in the doorway, the light from the corridor casting a long, predatory shadow over the stacks of boxes. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, as if I were a puzzle he had failed to solve. He didn't speak in threats, but in the soft, reasonable tone of a man who believed he was untouchable. He explained that some truths were too heavy for people like me to carry, and that if I let this go, Amihan would have the best medical care money could buy for the rest of her life. It was a deal with the devil offered in the dark of a warehouse. I realized then that Mateo wasn't just a partner. He was the senator's enforcer, and I was the only thing standing between him and the perfect crime. The invitation to the Ginto. Gala arrived on paper so thick it felt like a slab of marble. It was held at a private estate in the hills of Antipolo, a place where the air was supposed to be cleaner, far above the smog and the suffering of the city below. As we drove up the winding roads, Raphael gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white. He had spent the afternoon trying to convince me that we should just play along one last time, that once Tala was married into the Enriquez-connected real estate empire, our debts would vanish. He still didn't know I had seen the ledger. He didn't know that the sister he was trying to protect had been the one who drafted the documents that would have eventually sent him to prison as a scapegoat for the Bacolod leak. I looked at him, my husband, the father of my struggling child, and felt a wave of pity so strong it nearly eclipsed my anger. He was a man drowning in a sea of false loyalty, and I was about to set the water on fire. The estate was a nightmare of opulence. Sparkling fairy lights were draped over ancient acacia trees, and the sound of a live string quartet played soft, melancholic accompaniment songs that felt insulting in their beauty. Tala was at the center of it all, dressed in a custom-made terno with butterfly sleeves that looked like sharp, silver wings. She was holding court with Hero, her unsuspecting fiancé, and Senator Enriquez, who stood there like a benevolent god, sipping expensive brandy. I saw Mateo lurking in the shadows of the bar, his eyes tracking my every move. He thought his threat at the warehouse had worked. He thought the promise of medical care for Amihan had bought my silence. What he didn't realize was that Lito wasn't just a hospital orderly. He was the ghost that had been haunting this family for a decade. And tonight, he was working the catering staff, moving silently among the elite with a tray of drinks and a camera hidden in his lapel. The climax was meant to be a grand announcement. Tala's engagement and her appointment as the head of the Ginto Foundation, a supposed charity for industrial victims. When the senator took the stage to introduce her, the giant LED screens behind him were supposed to show a montage of her charitable works. My heart hammered against my ribs as I saw Lito give me a nearly imperceptible nod from across the lawn. I had given him the digital copies of the ledger and the recording of Mateo's confession. As the senator began to speak about family values and the future of our nation, the screen flickered. But instead of images of Tala hugging orphans, it showed a scanned copy of the autopsy report of Lito's daughter, followed by the handwritten notes in Tala's distinctive, elegant script detailing the bribe paid to the coroner. The music died. The only sound was the wind whistling through the acacia trees and the collective gasp of Manila's high society. The silence that followed was more deafening than any explosion. I watched Tala's face drain of color, her butterfly wings suddenly looking like the pinned remains of a dead insect. The screens continued to cycle. Through the evidence, the bank transfers from our medical fund to the senator's campaign. The emails where Mateo joked about Raphael's convenient guilt, Senator Enriquez tried to maintain his composure, gesturing for his security to shut down the system. But Lito had done his job well. The feed was being broadcast live to a major news outlet via a hidden uplink. The antagonist, from the side, the man who thought he could control the narrative through bribes and blood money, was suddenly exposed in the harsh glare of public scrutiny. Mateo tried to bolt toward the exit, but he was met by a group of men who weren't catering staff. They were investigators from the National Bureau of Investigation, tipped off by Lito's months of patient evidence gathering. Raphael stood beside me, trembling. He looked at the screen, then at his sister, and finally at me. For the first time in years, the fog in his eyes cleared. He realized that the family honor he had been protecting was a lie, manufactured by the very people who were bleeding him dry. Tala, realizing the game was up, turned on the senator, screaming that it was all his idea, that she was just a creative consultant. Her loyalty, so loudly proclaimed during the toasts, vanished in a heartbeat. It was a pathetic display of betrayal. I felt no triumph, only a grim satisfaction as I watched the police lead them away. The senator was ruined, his political career ending in the middle of his own gala. And Mateo was finally facing the justice he had evaded for a decade. As the guests scattered in a panic, I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Lito. He didn't smile. He just handed me a small envelope. Inside was a flash drive with the rest of the company's assets that he had managed to reroute back to an account in my name before Mateo could liquidate them. For the little one, he whispered. I realized then that Lito was the true protagonist of this tragedy, the man who had waited 10 years to avenge his daughter, not through violence, but through the cold, hard truth. He had used me as much as I had used him, and together, we had dismantled the dynasty built on the bones of Bacolod's children. I looked back at the house, the fairy lights flickering out, and realized that for the first time since Amihan was born, I could breathe. The aftermath was a whirlwind of legal depositions and hospital corridors, but this time the scent of bleach was replaced by the fresh, earthy smell of the coming monsoon. Amihan's recovery was slow, but without the constant stress of financial ruin and family betrayal, the atmosphere in her room felt lighter. The specialized medication that had been a point of blackmail was now fully funded by the assets Lito had helped me recover. My daughter was no longer a bargaining chip in a political game. She was a survivor. Raphael stayed by her side every day, not out of guilt, but out of a genuine, rediscovered love. He didn't ask for forgiveness immediately. He knew that rebuilding trust would take longer than any hospital stay. He started attending counseling, finally addressing the trauma of the Bacolod incident and the manipulation he had endured since childhood. Tala and Mateo were sentenced to lengthy prison terms for fraud, embezzlement, and their roles in the cover-up. The golden child found that the prison walls didn't care about her aesthetic or her social standing. Senator Enriquez's downfall triggered a massive investigation into industrial safety across the Philippines, a legacy that Lito watched from the sidelines with a quiet, somber pride. Lito refused any reward. He simply went back to his village in Bacolod, where a memorial was finally built for the victims of the leak. He sent me a photo of the memorial, a small garden filled with sampaguita, where children could play in safety. He had found his closure, and in doing so, he had given me mine. Today, as I sit in our small garden in Quezon City, watching Amihan take her first shaky steps on the grass, I think about the cost of secrets. I think about the sister-in-law who wanted a luxury vacation while a baby fought for life, and the friend who saw a business partner as a carcass to be picked clean. They are gone now, reduced to headlines in old newspapers. The air is humid, and the sky is a deep, bruised purple, promising rain. I look at Raphael, who is cheering for our daughter, his face bright with a simple, honest joy. We are not the same people we were before the ICU, and our family is no longer defined by blood alone. It is defined by the truth we fought for. the allies we found in the shadows, and the knowledge that sometimes the only way to save a family is to let the old one burn to the ground. The scent of Sampaguita is strong tonight, and for the first time in a long time, it smells like home.